And we are live. Welcome, everyone, to Emtrain's Always Learning. I'm Laraine McKinnon, a talent and culture strategist here with Emtrain. And our guest today is Rhodes Perry. Rhodes is author of Belonging at Work, Everyday Actions You Can Take to Cultivate an Inclusive Organization. He's a nationally recognized LGBTQ plus thought leader and works in consulting capacity with large organizations and their executives to achieve breakthroughs in diversity, equity, and inclusion. Welcome, Rhodes.
Thanks so much for having me, Laraine. It's great to be here.
Our pleasure. It was great to get to know you when we worked together with one of our clients, and really great to have you right now. Just a couple of weeks ago, the Supreme Court issued an opinion in Bostock versus Clayton County, Georgia, and in a 6-3 vote, they confirmed that the 1964 Civil Rights Act protections from discrimination based on sex apply to people who are lesbian, gay, and transgender. So it's a remarkable moment. And I was hoping we could start with you sharing, what it means to you and the broader community.
Yeah, well, thanks for leading with that question. That is, as someone who is both bisexual and transgender on an individual level, it was decades in the making, to see this victory. And I think for states, the 30 states that still, at the statewide level lack protections for LGBTQ folks in a variety of aspects of life, including employment, it's really a lifesaver. And it's a refreshing victory to have in this moment right now. So it's a little surreal. And as someone who has worked in the LGBT civil rights movement for quite some time, and my last job kind of working the movement was as the policy director for PFLAG National. Before the Equality Act, we were advocating for the Employment Non-Discrimination Act for many years, and so it feels great. It's a really important victory, and clearly there's still a lot of work to do. That is just a small sliver of civil rights legislation that's still needed for LGBTQ folks, but it's encouraging and it feels really great. So thanks for asking that.
Yeah, well, and congratulations to all of us. We believe in equality. We want to see people treated equally in the workplace, and this is a really important step to make sure that that can happen. Certainly, a lot of our clients were already focused on bringing equality and making sure that there was no bias or discrimination. But there are pockets of it, and they persist. And so this is an important line in the ground to say these are absolute protections. And then workplaces can think about how to further integrate these protections into their organization. And I know that's a lot of the work that you do.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, this is a baseline in terms of protections. So to simply say, hey, we can't discriminate against LGBTQ people, that's the beginning. And I think that when we look at laws and policies, and even if we're thinking about diversity, equity, and inclusion statements, that is kind of setting a tone, and it's something to hang our hats on when we're doing culture work that requires so much more. So how do we roll out the welcome mat? How do we signal as employers, as business owners that, yeah, we want to include LGBTQ folks inside of our organization, as well as to better serve LGBTQ communities? And really, it's looking at all kind of layers of an organization. So from the composition of who's on your team to the products and services that you're offering, making sure that they're culturally reflective of communities that you're serving, including LGBTQ folks. So there's still work to be done on that effort. And I'm really enthused by a 6-3 victory at the Supreme Court, making it more clear that when we're looking at protections on the basis of sex, that now includes LGBTQ folks. And I think that we'll see additional rulings in other aspects of life. So whether it's public accommodations or being served in a restaurant, staying at a hotel, making sure that those protections are also enshrined for LGBTQ people. And I think that will take time for the courts to kind of work through that. So I think for folks that you work with through Emtrain, the folks that I work with, it's really thinking more from what can employers do right now with this very clear guidance from the Supreme Court and other aspects of the workplace to really make sure that that obviously LGBT people can't be fired for who they are, who they love, but what more is needed to communicate that we belong in the workplace as well.
Yeah, and one of the topics that we were focused on was health protections.
Yes.
Because just before the Supreme Court opinion came out, there were the health protections that were starting to get rolled back. And many Americans have their health care through their employer. And so you had suggested that there were some things that companies can be doing to make sure that people know that they've got healthcare access.
Absolutely. So for companies that have healthcare available for their employees, making sure that there's family planning options for LGBTQ folks, making sure that there aren't any exclusions for trans people receiving basic healthcare, let alone healthcare that we may need in order to lead healthy and happy lives. So again, the Supreme Court has really made it clear that when we're talking about protections on the basis of sex, that LGBTQ folks are included. The administration has the opportunity, Health and Human Services in particular, to rescind that ruling now to make sure that it is in alignment with the highest court in the land. Now, whether or not that they do that, that's a different, that's a different calculus that is above my pay grade. I don't work there. So, and I think that the courts are there to do that interpretation at the different levels of the court system. My concern is for LGBTQ folks and trans people in particular, non-binary folks who need life-saving healthcare right now. This rule this adds a degree of confusion for healthcare workers. Hopefully, most healthcare systems are going to treat anyone who needs healthcare in alignment with the Hippocratic Oath. And there are some doctors and nurses and healthcare professionals that are using their personal or religious beliefs to say, hey, you're LGBT, I can't serve you. And while the courts are there to make sure that justice is available, if someone is needing life-saving care today, the courts and the slow process of the courts will not necessarily be able to bring someone back, if they pass away because they didn't receive the care that they need. So that's a big concern for me as a member of the LGBTQ community. It's a concern as someone who's working with employers, just to make sure that they understand that there's still so many gaps for us, just to be able to bring as much of our authentic selves to work as we want, and making sure that we get what we need in order to do our best work on the jobs that we do have.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I know you've got expertise there, having worked for healthcare systems and also having done a lot of social policy and racial policy in New York City.
Yes.
So you've got an amazing background and would be a great advisor to organizations looking to help figure out how to make sure that they're giving care equally to anyone in need. And of course, with COVID-19, it's so important, and we can broaden that lens, not just within the LGBTQ community, but also to people of color.
Yes.
We're still seeing higher infection rates and higher death rates across the Black and Brown community. And for folks who are experiencing disabilities as well, who may have compromised autoimmune systems or other exacerbations that COVID, exacerbates, issues that COVID exacerbates. So thank you for sharing that, and thank you for all of your expertise in that space.
Yeah, definitely. And I think on the piece, when you're thinking about different aspects of social identity, we're talking about LGBTQ folks, we're a microcosm of the world. So we all have a sexual orientation and a gender identity. So for a trans person like me, I have the trappings of white privilege. So, and yet there's still hesitancy, if I needed life-saving care, the first question in my head is this hospital going to be culturally responsive to the care that I need as a transgender man? You layer that on for my friends and colleagues who are BIPOC folks, who are also trans, non-binary. You've got another layer of institutional racism that exists in these healthcare settings for basic healthcare. So we're living through a pandemic right now. So unfortunately, we're seeing that disproportionality impact our communities. And for those of us that have more intersectional identities that are marginalized, it's additional barriers that I think it's important to have these conversations, and in particular for leaders in the healthcare industry to be very, very aware of those disparities and to have active conversations right now. And something that we are going to be talking about is this active deep listening. And that's really important too, is that sometimes we don't know what we don't know. And for leaders, this is an opportunity to take a beat, to pause, and to really connect with stakeholders across their systems and hear harm that has been done in the past, understand barriers that exist right now, reflect back of like, hey, we've heard you on this. Did we get it right? And to allow that moment of editing, for stakeholders to say, no, Rhodes, you absolutely did not get this right. Here's what we're trying to communicate, so that we can get to a place that business leaders are able to give their stakeholders what they need. And to me, I think that's what equity is in action.
Mm-hmm. Yep. It's such great advice, the deep listening. The other advice that I really appreciate from your book, Belonging at Work, is where you're talking about intentionality and creating a really intentional culture. Right. And I think that there's sort of, you must do the listening in order to create the intentional culture. Can you talk a little bit more about what you mean by intentional culture and how you work with clients to help them with it?
Yeah, absolutely. So in terms of intentional culture, what I mean is that in most workplaces, there are dominant groups, right? And if we look at Fortune 500 companies, I don't think anyone who's listening right now will be shocked to look at the composition of the C-suite or the board of directors to see a sea of whiteness and a sea of largely men, right? And so that's what I mean by a dominant culture. And when leaders, when they start their businesses, or like many of the CEOs that I just mentioned, they walked in chances into an organization that has existed for decades, if not longer. So if there hasn't been a clear distinction of the type of culture that an organization is striving for, it may not have yet, they're left with what I could say is an implicit culture, which is a culture that is reflecting back that dominant culture. So chances are I surround a lot of my work in the framework of belonging, safety, trust, and belonging. And a recent study just came out from the Center of Talent and Innovation called The Power of Belonging. And I was one of the folks that was interviewed for that. And what I love in that is that they break down by job function people who feel a strong sense of belonging. And not surprising, I think it was close to 80% of folks in the C-suite feel a strong sense of belonging. And I think that is because, and I don't have quantitative data here, but I don't think it would be a stretch to say that is largely because there's an implicit culture and folks are in alignment with that kind of dominant culture. And I think if we want to create organizations that embrace multiculturalism, that reflect communities that are being served, and meaning that the highest level of leadership is reflective of that, organizations would be wise to really name the type of culture that they're striving for and create metrics to make sure, hey, are we on track to get that organizational culture that we can see, that we can hear, that we have a strong feeling of when we reach this, and those who are least likely to feel a sense of psychological safety and trust are feeling what we feel right now, we're on a better track. And I think that's possible. I think it just requires, again, to pause and to ask some difficult questions and be committed to continue to be curious, ask those questions, and continue to do the work. And a piece of that is to resist this urge of these kind of quick wins or things that need to be fixed, and we put a Band-Aid on, and then we can kind of say, all right, we did the work, we're done, we've got the culture that we want. Unfortunately, organizational change work, culture work, it doesn't work. It's not that easy, and it requires a long-term commitment. And one thing that I think resonates a lot with me and folks that I work with is this idea of building a culture together. There's something about building something together that seems to inspire and ignite the innovation that we have that's innate as human beings, that feels more positive from my perspective, as opposed to this doom and gloom of we have to fix a broken culture. I think that it's a mindset shift in some respects, but really naming the type of culture that you want your organization to exude is the first step in doing this work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and in the opportunity of bringing everyone into that work, having everybody take ownership of the inclusive culture, to have that drive part of your employee engagement, and to come up with these crowdsourced ideas from your own employees about things that would make the workplace better. And to contrast, something like that versus a statement that a company might put on a career page on their website, or a statement that might make about Black Lives Matter.
Mm-hmm.
And we've talked a lot about all the statements that were rolled out around Black Lives Matter, and then really wondering, well, what are you doing inside of the organization? So you've made a public statement, and you've denounced racism, and you have said you are supporting the Black community. And how are you doing that internally? What have you changed? We were talking about the Black Lives Matter statement started to roll out around June 1st. So maybe around December 1st, we say, okay, so you've had 6 months. What have you done?
Yeah.
And I think that that's part of the change management, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's part of the, people are worried about putting numbers to things, or, putting out firm goals in the future that they may or may not be able to make. And yet, if you don't track numbers, and if you don't put out goals, you're not holding yourself accountable for any progress.
Absolutely.
How do you think about that when you work with your clients?
Yeah, you measure what matters, right? And there are ways, and now I'm so grateful for the study around the power of belonging, because there are elements to belonging that can be measured. So, when I wrote the book in 2018, a lot of people were excited by it, and I would say more folks that are kind of left brain are like, okay, this is great. I need a clear definition, and I need to measure this so that we can do it. And it almost kind of errs into, we have to fix a broken culture, right? But the thinking is, but how do we measure this? And there are very clear ways on how to do this now. And I agree with you, benchmarking to reach that goal, to assess, we want to have this particular culture. Here are the steps to get there. We've crowdsourced ideas. We're leaving this open so that we have an ongoing dialogue and discussion is a way to do it. And it has to be, in my opinion, this is not extra work. This is just, it's different folks throughout the organization recognizing their role, just like the role of the mission of the organization. Everyone kind of knows their part. It's being clear on what your part is in building a healthier workplace culture, because it's going to take all of us, and there's truly no small role to play in doing this. And it only takes one person to really introduce a toxic workplace that kind of sucks the oxygen out of the room for everyone. And it does the opposite of what you want your organization to do, which is to be really, really innovative, allow your people to do their best work. And for me, like, doing my best work is knowing I can show up as authentically as I want. And I think for a lot of folks, that's what they crave, is just to be themselves as they do their jobs, to be recognized, and to have pride in what they're doing together and what they're accomplishing. And I think more organizations are seeing this now in this movement for more racial justice in the workplace in particular. And I think that's a great thing. And again, I think it's a humbling process for a lot of leaders who, again, just take a pause and listen, deeply listen, and practice those skills, because in my opinion, that is an essential trait for the future of leadership in the workplace.
Absolutely. Yeah, we couldn't agree more. We at Emtrain do online training, as you know, and you've experienced through bias training, preventing workplace harassment. And we ask a lot of questions to engage the learners. And we ask them about their sense of belonging. We ask them if they feel like they can be their authentic selves at work. And we can deliver those results back both to the learner, so they can see where they stand versus peers and the global benchmark. And then we package those up and give them to the employer, the organization. And a lot of executives are really surprised that they might have a bifurcated, like, 2 cohorts in the belonging question. So some people feel that they very much belong. And then there's a group that feels they very much don't belong. Yes. And that often comes as a surprise. So I think of this data and the employee sentiment data that comes in a training where you're employing the growth mindset, where you're showing different perspectives, where you're trying to teach and grow empathy. That's deep listening. It may not be you're listening to someone in their words in a moment, but you're also giving them the safe space to to answer a question in the way that they truly feel.
Yes.
They know it's anonymized. They know it's aggregated. We get a lot of text answers as well, and you can see from the text answers that people share, that they really trust the interaction that they have with our training, and they've got something to say.
Yes.
And that's been a wonderful way to help executives to listen right within what's often mandatory training.
Yes, and it's so powerful because you're getting real time what's happening in that moment. And we've chatted about this before. The employee engagement and surveys are fantastic. In that moment, they're a snapshot. And you had alluded to work that I had done in New York, having worked in child welfare systems, juvenile justice systems. These are systems with high turnover because there's a lot of secondary trauma that's happening in those organizations. Organizations that could, get on that pathway towards building a healthier culture and not quite there yet. So that real snapshot in time, both comparing if you've done an employee engagement survey and the technology that you have through the learning and development programs you all offer, is a good way of crosswalking. Okay, we did this in 2018. Here's where we are in 2020. Wow, we were able to look at the sense of belonging at different levels of the organization, and for leaders to really check their assumptions and also the ego of, okay, there's still work to be done, and we can build something better together. Being open to that, and having that curiosity. And again, it's a trait of inclusive leadership, and that's the kind of leadership, in my opinion, that is really required for this moment. Because the old ways of leading organizations, command and control, the leader knowing everything, which the reality is we know that's not true, right? Is being okay with asking the questions and saying, I don't know. And I want to work as a team together to get there together as a team, right? And that can be challenging for folks who've been trained in different models of leadership. Mm-hmm. So it's great that service that you offer, and hopefully leaders who get that information really see that as a gift to build something better.
Yeah, I would say that there are certainly some surprises. We're seeing organizations say, well, this is really valuable information. We didn't have it. We didn't have it from a culture survey. And we want to understand this by department, by executive leader. We want to know what groups have a greater sense of belonging. Mm-hmm. And we want to, those are the leaders that we want to lift through our organization. Those are the groups that we want to understand how they're doing it and see if we can spread some of those best practices and the way things really work around here in this one group is much more inclusive than it is over here. And so how can we transfer some of that knowledge and some of those skills and elevate the leaders who are particularly good at creating belonging within their organization? And that's sort of a segue because I know you do some individual work with executives, and I'm interested in that because executives at companies are being asked to have conversations about racial justice, mm-hmm. Conversations about LGBTQ and sexual orientation, conversations about disabilities, particularly in light of COVID and thinking about bringing people back to work and whether that's really safe for a portion of their population. And they're not used to having a lot of those conversations. So how do you help people learn the sensitivity and the appropriateness of asking questions and learning more when they do actually need to be able to help people in their organization?
Yeah, so that's a big question. And I think, starting with, creating a safer space for a one-on-one dialogue to have the room for that particular leader that I'm working with to use their own words and to name, their fears, worries, or concerns, and playing a more active role in truly owning this work. And it's, a lot of it is confidence building and education, and really a space to listen and allow for mistakes to happen. And I think that when you have the eye, depending on your organization and how big that organization is, there's a lot of pressure for perfectionism, right? Which we know, in the work that we do, that's a trait of white supremacy culture. So it's again kind of changing at least the cultural norms that happen in a coaching environment, like one-on-one, where we can suspend perfectionism. The media is not watching you. You're in a space to learn. You're in a space to grow. Connecting those leaders with anti-racist practices and walking through what that is, and it depends where people are in their own journeys. And like with knowledge in general, which is infinite, the learning journey of really understanding the oppression and the power dynamics that exist inside one organization, let alone the culture that we're in, it requires grace, and it requires going at the speed of trust. And so that's the kind of space that I try to create, and it's different for each and every leader. At this moment in time, people are reaching out because harm has occurred in an organization, and sometimes that particular leader has contributed to the harm. So we talk through what that is. We talk through what repair looks like. We talk through about building trust again, trying to create a safer organization. In my opinion, those are the foundations of eventually getting to the sense of belonging, is that safety has to be there in the organization and trust has to be built. And if harms plural have occurred, there has to be that space for healing. And again, I think that's a missed opportunity for leaders and leadership teams in general, is that urgency of harm has been caused. We must immediately fix the problem. And there's a gap. There's never this opportunity for learning and repair and dialogue. And I, as a business owner myself, I know people are moving. We're in a pretty scary time economically as well. So there's an urgency for leadership teams to try to do this as fast as possible. And I would really encourage those that are listening and have the opportunity to share this information with their leadership teams, like, please make plenty of room for that repair process. Because even in the most perfect world, to build a healthier culture, because you're moving at the speed of trust, it's so much about the process and what's learned through that process. And if it's an ongoing process and there's an ongoing commitment, you're in the best possible position. If you're a leader that views this work as something that's finite and it's going to take 6 months and then you're done, please rewatch this. Just keep checking in with yourself about why, like, what's that urgency? Because our organizations are reflective of our people, and as humans, we're constantly changing and growing, and hopefully our trend is growing to be a little more evolved, and with that, that will change our practices in business.
Yeah. So back to that intentionality, back to the deep listening, giving yourself the time for the deep listening, appreciating, what you might have done wrong in the past,
Mm-hmm.
and figuring out how you could remedy it, how you would do it differently if you had the same situation come up again. I think that's a lot of the learning that we try to show in our video scenes, in our trainings, to almost make you feel like you've experienced it and you've understood that there's a better way to handle it when something happens.
Absolutely.
That is, we call this always learning, because we are all always learning. I love the concept of the infinite journey. Completely agree. Thank you so much for joining us today. Anyone listening who has not read Rhodes' book, I strongly encourage it. You can find Belonging at Work on Amazon, and you can find Rhodes Perry on LinkedIn. And you can also follow Emtrain here on LinkedIn, and we are at www.emtrain.com. So the time went by super fast. Thank you so much, Rhodes, for joining us. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. This was great. Thank you.
Look forward to talking to you again soon. Thanks, everyone.